The road twisted like a long dark ribbon through the Blue Ridge foothills, slick with rain and reflecting the pale glow of Jackson Pierce's headlights. Trees pressed in on both sides, tall and indifferent, their branches scraping lightly against one another as if whispering secrets he wasn't meant to hear. Jackson slowed his SUV without fully realizing why. He hadn't planned to be out here. No assistant had scheduled this drive. No meeting waited at the other end. He just needed air. At 46, Jackson had more than enough of everything people usually chased: money, influence, privacy when he wanted it, attention when he didn't. His tech company had gone public years earlier. His name appeared on donor lists and business panels. Strangers shook his hand with a little too much enthusiasm, as if proximity alone might rub off on them. But tonight none of that mattered. The silence inside the car felt heavier than the rain. The windshield wipers moved in a steady rhythm. Back and forth, back and forth. The sound reminded him of a clock, counting something down. He passed a wooden sign half hidden by ivy. Private land. No trespassing. He barely registered it. His thoughts were elsewhere, on an argument he'd avoided with his sister weeks ago, on a penthouse apartment that felt more like a hotel room than a home, on the strange realization that success hadn't made him feel safer. Just busier. As he rounded a curve, something flashed white in the corner of his vision. Jackson's foot eased off the gas. Another flash. This time unmistakable. Fabric. Too bright. Too deliberate to be a trick of the rain. He braked fully and pulled onto the narrow shoulder. The engine idled as he stared into the trees. For a moment he considered driving on. The rational part of his mind lined up reasons quickly. It was dark. The land was posted. People got hurt doing foolish, impulsive things. But the image wouldn't leave him. Why? So wrong. He shut off the engine. The quiet rushed in immediately, thick and alive. Rain pattered against leaves. Somewhere deeper in the woods something moved. An animal, maybe. Or maybe not. Jackson grabbed the flashlight from his glove compartment and stepped out. Cold air seeped through his coat. The ground gave slightly under his shoes as he crossed the shallow ditch and pushed past low branches. Hello. His voice sounded smaller out here. The beam of light cut through darkness, bouncing off wet bark and fallen leaves. He followed the slope downward, heart beginning to thud harder with each step. The white shape appeared again, closer now, tangled near the base of a massive oak. The flashlight shook. It wasn't fabric caught on a branch. It was a woman. She was standing, or trying to, pressed against the tree, her body angled awkwardly as if movement hurt. A wedding dress hung off her frame, once elegant, now torn and smeared with mud. The hem was soaked dark. One sleeve had ripped completely. Chains wrapped around her wrists and the trunk behind her, thick and rusted, biting into skin that looked raw and swollen. Her face lifted toward the light. "Please," she said. The word barely carried. It scraped its way out of her throat. Jackson stopped breathing for a second. His mind scrambled, rejecting what his eyes insisted was real. This didn't happen. Not here. Not like this. Not outside the carefully contained tragedies he read about on screens. "Oh my God," he whispered, then immediately felt useless for saying it. Hey, I'm here. I won't hurt you." Her eyes tracked every movement he made. Dark, sure. Terrified in a way that spoke of long practice. "Don't leave," she said. "They always leave." "I'm not leaving," he said quickly, stepping closer, then forcing himself to slow when she flinched. "I swear. I need to get these off you." The chains were heavier than he expected. Cold. Real. He fumbled with them, fingers clumsy, adrenaline making everything harder. His breath fogged in front of him. He could smell damp earth, metal, something sour beneath it all that made his stomach turn. "Did someone do this to you?" he asked, not sure why. Maybe to keep her talking. Maybe to prove to himself she was real. She let out a short, broken sound that might have been a laugh. "Does it matter?" The lock finally gave with a sharp click. The chain dropped, hitting the ground with a dull thud that echoed too loudly in the quiet woods. She sagged forward, knees buckling. Jackson caught her without thinking, feeling how light she was, how violently she shook. "I've got you," he said. "You're safe." At least, you're not alone anymore. She pressed her forehead briefly against his shoulder, then pulled back just enough to look at him. Rain streaked down her face, mixing with dirt and tears he suspected she hadn't let fall until now. "Why are you here?" she asked. Jackson didn't have an answer that made sense. He never would. He only knew that something had shifted the moment he stopped the car. "My name's Jackson," he said instead. "What's yours?" She hesitated just long enough for him to notice. "Jasmine," she said. Somewhere behind them, deeper in the forest, a branch snapped. Neither of them moved. And as Jackson lifted his head, listening, a thought slid into his mind. Quiet, unwelcome, impossible to ignore. If he had found her by accident, who else knew she was here? If you're listening to this story and want to know what happens next, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the moment everything starts to unravel. And if you're out there tonight, listening from somewhere quiet or familiar, you're not alone either. Jackson didn't move. Neither did Jasmine. The forest held its breath. Rain ticked softly against leaves, a steady, almost gentle sound that clashed with the tension coiled tight in Jackson's chest. The snapped branch echoed in his mind, replaying again and again. He angled the flashlight deeper into the trees, the beam trembling despite his effort to steady it. "Did you hear that?" Jasmine whispered. "I did," he said quietly. "Stay close to me." Her fingers tightened around his sleeve with surprising strength. It wasn't panic alone holding her upright now. It was instinct, survival. Jackson scanned the darkness. The woods were thick, layered, full of places for someone, or something, to hide. His rational side tried to intervene. It could have been a raccoon, a deer, even a falling limb weakened by rain. But the look in Jasmine's eyes told him she didn't believe in coincidences anymore. "They come back sometimes," she said. "To check." A chill ran through him that had nothing to do with the cold. "Who?" She swallowed. "I don't know who anymore. I just know they don't like witnesses." Jackson's jaw tightened. He forced himself to breathe slowly, evenly, the way he had during high-stakes negotiations when millions of dollars were on the line. Only this time the stakes felt immeasurably higher. "We're leaving," he said. "Right now." He wrapped his arm around her shoulders and guided her back up the slope toward the road. Every step felt loud. Leaves crunched underfoot. Twigs snapped. He half expected a shout, a hand grabbing him from behind, a beam of light cutting through the dark. Nothing happened. They reached the ditch. Jackson helped her across carefully, wincing when she hissed in pain as her bare foot slipped. He opened the passenger door and eased her inside. She curled inward immediately, pulling the jacket tighter around herself, eyes darting to the tree lean. Jackson shut the door and moved quickly around the car. His hands shook as he started the engine. The headlights flooded the forest edge, revealing nothing but rain-soaked bark and shadows. As he pulled back onto the road, Jasmine flinched when a pair of headlights appeared behind them in the distance. "Don't stop," she said urgently. "Please don't stop." "I'm not," he replied, though his pulse spiked. The car behind them stayed far back, moving at a steady pace. After a mile, it turned off onto a side road and disappeared. Only then did Jasmine's shoulders slump. She stared down at her hands, red and swollen where the chains had been. Jackson glanced at her, then back at the road. "Are you hurt anywhere else?" he asked. "My ankle," she said. "I don't know. Everything feels wrong." "We'll get you checked," he said. "But first, somewhere safe. Somewhere quiet." She nodded faintly. "Quiet is good." They drove in silence for several minutes. Jackson's thoughts raced. Calling the police felt like the obvious choice, and yet something about Jasmine's fear made him hesitate. This wasn't just fear of her captor. It was fear of systems, of exposure, of being found before she could disappear again. "Do you trust me?" he asked suddenly. Her head lifted. "I don't trust anyone," she said honestly. Then after a pause, "But you stopped." He took that as a yes, or at least the closest thing to one he was going to get. Jackson turned onto a narrower road that led away from town, deeper into the hills. After several minutes, Jasmine noticed the change. "Where are we going?" she asked. "I have a place," he said. "A cabin. It's not far." No neighbors. No cameras except mine. She studied him in profile as if weighing his words against her instincts. Finally she nodded. The cabin appeared out of the darkness like a low, steady promise. Lights off. Quiet. Jackson unlocked the door and guided her inside, flipping on a lamp that cast a warm glow across wood-paneled walls and simple furniture. Jasmine stood just inside, frozen, listening. "No one else is here," Jackson said. "I promise." Her knees buckled then, the adrenaline finally draining. Jackson caught her again, this time lowering her carefully onto the couch. He fetched a blanket, a bottle of water, first aid supplies he kept stocked but rarely used. As he cleaned the cuts on her wrist, she winced but didn't pull away. "They put the dress on me," she said suddenly. "Said it would make things official." Jackson's hands stilled for a fraction of a second. "Who?" She stared at the wall, voice flat. "A man named Gregory." The name settled heavily between them. Outside, the rain began to fall harder, drumming against the roof. And somewhere, far beyond the warm circle of the cabin light, something, or someone, shifted as if adjusting to a change in plans. Jackson kept his gaze fixed on Jasmine as she sat on the edge of the couch, knees pulled up, her wedding dress now discarded in a damp heap on the floor. Her fingers traced the jagged lines of her wrist where the chains had bitten deep. Every movement was careful, almost mechanical, as if she feared breaking herself by accident. I don't even know how long it's been," she said quietly, voice tight with memory. "Days? Weeks? Months?" Her eyes darted to the window, flinching at the wind rattling the panes. "Time didn't make sense where I was. Everything was just." Her voice trailed off, leaving only the rain as punctuation. Jackson knelt beside her, letting the weight of silence settle for a moment before speaking. "It doesn't matter how long. You're safe now. And I won't let anyone hurt you again." Her gaze snapped to his, a mix of skepticism and faint relief. "Safe? You don't know what that means." "Safe hasn't existed for me." "Not really." He nodded slowly, understanding that this wasn't just about physical chains. It was about every person, every choice, every moment that had forced her into hiding. "Then maybe we'll have to figure out what safe means together." She looked at him like he had just offered something impossible. But the corners of her mouth lifted slightly, a flicker of the humor she'd buried somewhere deep inside. "That's the cheesiest billionaire line I've ever heard." Jackson chuckled softly. "I'll take that as a compliment." The small laugh broke a tension that had been wrapped around the room like wet cloth. It was fragile, fleeting, but it existed. He realized then that Jasmine wasn't just a victim. She was a person who had survived unimaginable circumstances. And survival, he knew, came with its own kind of resilience that couldn't be chained or broken. He moved to the window and drew back the curtain slightly. Rain streaked the glass, and the forest beyond seemed alive, watching, waiting. "I'm going to make you something to eat," he said. "You should rest. Your body's been through a lot." She didn't respond immediately. When she finally did, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Thank you, Jackson." While he prepared a simple meal, eggs, toast, water, he thought about the next steps. Calling the authorities would bring cameras, interviews, questions. He could see her recoil already at the idea. She wasn't ready. And he wasn't sure anyone could truly be ready after what she'd endured. He carried the plate back to her, setting it on the coffee table. "Eat," he said gently. "We'll figure out the rest later." She picked at the food, each bite hesitant, her body still tight with tension. Jackson watched, torn between wanting to give her space and wanting to do everything to protect her. After a while, she began to speak in fragments, words spilling out like broken pieces trying to form a story. "His name? Gregory. He said I belonged to him. That I was supposed to marry him. Or die trying. He kept me there. I don't know, in the woods. He didn't care if I existed outside of it." Jackson swallowed hard, the imagery he imagined turning his stomach. He reached out, brushing her hair gently from her face. "Jasmine, you're here now. That's what matters. You're not there anymore." Tears ran down her cheeks, unbidden, and she pressed her face into her hands. Jackson waited silently, letting her cry. Not for pity. Not for relief, but because sometimes that's what healing started with, being allowed to feel. Minutes passed. The rain softened outside, becoming a quiet drizzle. The forest seemed almost peaceful now, but Jackson knew better. Danger, uncertainty, shadows, they all existed just beyond the edge of that cabin. And yet, for the first time in what felt like forever, Jasmine was alive and she was not alone. Finally, she lifted her head. Her eyes, glistening with moisture, met his. I don't even know how to thank you. You don't have to, he said softly. Just stay here. Say, that's enough for now. A branch scraped against the window. Both of them froze and Jackson's pulse spiked. The forest was alive. Too alive. Shadows shifted in patterns that weren't random. Jasmine's hands trembled slightly on her knees. Jackson placed a hand over hers. It's okay, he said firmly. Whatever it is, we'll handle it. Together. Her lips parted as if to respond, but no words came. Outside, the rain intensified again, and the soft tapping against the roof became a heartbeat, steady, insistent, reminding them both that the world outside was still unpredictable, still dangerous. Jackson turned back to her, a sense of determination settling in his chest. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. But for the first time since he'd found her, he felt something he hadn't in years. A purpose beyond business, beyond money, a reason to act, to protect, to face whatever came next. He glanced at her, caught the faintest hint of resolve returning to her eyes. And in that moment, neither of them spoke, but both understood. Whatever the forest had taken from her, whatever danger still lurked beyond the cabin walls, they would face it together. And somewhere deep in the woods, a shadow shifted, watching, waiting, as if aware that the game had just begun. Jackson sat on the edge of the couch, watching Jasmine slowly unwrap the blanket she had clutched like a shield. Every movement was deliberate, cautious, like she was testing the world 1 inch at a time. Outside, the rain had slowed to a soft drizzle, pattering gently against the cabin roof. Inside, the air was still and heavy, carrying the scent of damp wood and faint antiseptic from the wipes he'd used on her wrists. I can't believe I'm actually sitting on a couch, she muttered almost to herself. Not a floor. Not a tree root. A couch. Jackson smiled faintly, grateful for the tiny bit of humor. Yeah, it's not too bad. You can even sit upright without worrying about dirt and chains. She gave a half laugh, half sob. Chains don't make much of a comeback story, do they? He shook his head, still studying her. No, but you do. Her eyes flicked up to him. Do I? Or are you just being nice? Maybe both, he said, leaning back in the chair across from her. But I've learned over the years that people who survive, well, they have something you can't fake. Strength, stubbornness, some combination of both. You've got it. She didn't respond immediately, only stared at the floorboards, picking at a splintered line in the wood with her fingernail. The silence stretched long enough to feel uncomfortable, but Jackson didn't break it. Sometimes words were unnecessary. Finally, she muttered, almost in disbelief, I think I forgot what it felt like to be just normal. To exist without someone watching, controlling, deciding everything for me. Jackson's stomach tightened. He wanted to say something reassuring, something that would erase the past months or years of trauma. But he knew better. You couldn't erase that. All you could do was offer a space where someone could breathe again. Normal is overrated, he said lightly, trying to ease the tension. She shot him a look, half annoyed, half amused. Okay, maybe that was a little ridiculous, he added. Jasmine let out a small laugh, her first genuine one since he'd found her. You're ridiculous, she said, shaking her head. But at least you're harmless. Most of the time, he replied with a smirk. After a moment, Jackson stood. I'm going to check the perimeter, make sure no one followed us. He grabbed the flashlight again and stepped outside, the cool air brushing against his face. The forest was alive, shadows flickering between the trees, leaves rustling under the weight of the rain. Every instinct screamed at him to hurry, to keep moving, to stay vigilant. Minutes later he returned. All clear, he said, lowering the flashlight. For now. We'll need to think about long-term safety soon, but for tonight you're safe here. Jasmine looked at him, uncertainty in her eyes. I don't. I don't know if I can ever feel that again. You don't have to feel it all at once, he said. One small step at a time is enough. She nodded slowly, and he could see a flicker of something inside her, a spark, faint but persistent. They ate in silence, the soft clinking of utensils the only sound. Jackson kept glancing at her, worried about her body, her mind, her reactions to everything. Each movement she made, each word she spoke, reminded him of the fragility of her situation, and how careful he needed to be. Later, she moved to the window, watching the forest outside. "It's huge," she whispered. "And dark. And I feel like it's still watching me." Jackson came up beside her, placing a steady hand on her shoulder. "You're allowed to be scared. You're allowed to hate the forest for what it did. But you're not in it anymore. And you're not alone." She let the words sink in, leaning slightly into his presence. And in that moment, Jackson realized something. Trust wasn't given lightly. It had to be earned day by day, moment by moment. But even in that small cabin, with the rain still falling outside, there was no guarantee of safety. Every shadow beyond the glass, every creak of the floorboards, every distant crack of a branch reminded them both that danger lingered, closer than they could see. Jasmine turned back to him, voice quiet but firm. "I'm tired of running." Jackson met her gaze, a weight settling on his chest. "Then maybe it's time we start standing." Outside, the forest waited, patient and dark, as if it had heard the promise and was preparing its own response. Jackson spent the early morning hours pacing the cabin, his mind racing faster than the rain-slicked roads outside. Jasmine slept fitfully on the couch, curled beneath the blanket, her breathing shallow and uneven. Every so often she would stir, murmuring fragments of words, names, places, shadows, and Jackson would freeze, listening, heart tightening with each sound. He hadn't expected responsibility to feel this heavy. Wealth had never meant this much before. Never like this. It wasn't a deal to close, a board to convince, or a problem to delegate. This was someone's life, someone's trauma. And he could feel the weight of it pressing against him in the quiet, pressing him to act. By mid-morning, he had started outlining a plan in his head. The cabin was isolated, but isolation was a double-edged sword. It kept her safe from immediate threats, but it also left them vulnerable if someone was watching, or worse, tracking them. He needed to secure the perimeter, create contingencies, and anticipate every possible angle. He found a roll of rope and some tools in the garage, relics from past cabin trips, and began reinforcing doors and windows. Every latch he tightened, every board he inspected felt like a small reassurance. He imagined Gregory, or whoever might come next, approaching, and the fear he saw in Jasmine's eyes flashed in his mind again. He clenched his fists and forced himself to focus. Planning, preparation, vigilance. That was the only way forward. Jasmine woke with a start, blinking rapidly as she tried to orient herself in the dim cabin light. "Morning," she said hoarsely, voice raw. Her hair stuck to her damp cheeks and she rubbed at her wrists automatically. "Morning," Jackson replied, crouching beside her. "Sleep okay?" "Not really," she admitted. "Dreams?" "The forest." She shivered slightly. "Even here I feel like I can hear it sometimes." Jackson nodded, keeping his voice calm. "You're safe here. I promise. No one's coming." She let out a shaky breath, but he noticed the faint tension still coiled in her shoulders. "I don't know how to be safe. I don't even know what that looks like anymore." "Then we'll figure it out together," he said. He didn't add the unspoken truth, it wouldn't be easy. She had lived under fear for too long, and trust wasn't something that could be rebuilt overnight. He made her breakfast simple and warm, and they ate quietly. Every sound, the scrape of a fork, the distant call of a bird, the occasional creak of the cabin, was amplified in the stillness, reminders that the world outside wasn't quite as calm as it seemed. Afterward, Jackson suggested a short walk around the property. Jasmine hesitated but finally agreed, wrapping herself in his jacket. The forest pressed close on all sides, its damp scent mixing with pine and wet earth. Every branch that brushed the ground or snapped underfoot made her flinch. "They're out there," she said softly. "Always watching." Jackson didn't respond immediately. He didn't want to argue or dismiss her fear. Instead, he kept his hand lightly on the small of her back, a steady presence. Then we'll keep moving. Step by step, inch by inch. As they circled the property, Jackson noted vulnerabilities. A low window, a broken fence post, patches of ground that could be dug through. He filed mental notes, imagining every scenario, every potential intruder. Each observation made him more determined. Back inside, he showed her a small map of the surrounding area he'd sketched, marking exits, vantage points, and safe spots. Jasmine studied it, a spark of focus returning to her eyes. For the first time since he had found her, she began asking questions, not just about him but about what she could do to protect herself. "You really think someone could be watching us even now?" she asked. "It's possible," he said. "But that doesn't mean we can't be ready. We'll be smarter than they are." Her brow furrowed in thought. "You really think I can do that? That I can be ready?" "I do," Jackson replied. "You survived before. That counts for a lot." A long silence settled between them. Outside, the rain began again, tapping softly against the roof. Inside, the cabin felt both safe and fragile, a delicate bubble separating them from the uncertainty lurking beyond the trees. Finally, Jasmine spoke, her voice quieter but steadier. "I want to learn to fight back, maybe. Even if it's just little things." Jackson smiled faintly, a glimmer of hope threading through the tension. "Then we'll start small. One step at a time. You won't have to face anything alone." But as he looked out the window, his gut tightened. He had secured doors, reinforced windows, and mapped escape routes. But he knew deep down that danger wasn't just outside the cabin walls. It was patient, clever, and relentless. And tonight, the forest would remind them of that truth. The cabin was quiet that evening, save for the occasional drip of rain from the eaves and the faint creak of settling wood. Jasmine sat cross-legged on the couch, her fingers tracing the hem of her damp shirt. Jackson watched her from the armchair, unsure whether to speak or let her fill the silence herself. He had learned that patience was often more effective than words, especially with someone like her, someone who had spent so long surviving that trust was almost foreign. I remember bits," she said after a long pause, voice low. "Not everything. Just pieces." Jackson leaned forward. "Pieces are better than nothing. Start wherever you want." She swallowed hard and let her eyes wander to the floor. Gregory, he was calm most of the time. Quiet. That was the worst part. You never knew when he was watching or listening, so you couldn't relax. Even breathing felt dangerous. Jackson's chest tightened. He locked you up? Like physically?" Her nod was barely perceptible. "Chains at first. Later just rules, threats. I couldn't step outside the forest boundary. Couldn't talk to anyone. Sometimes I'd hear voices from far away, people he'd forced into the same game. And when you're that isolated, it warps your head. Makes everything slippery. Time, memory, reality." Jackson swallowed. He could imagine the suffocating fear, the constant uncertainty. And the wedding dress? Her lips pressed together. It was part of it. A joke. A trap. He said it made it official. That I belonged to him. Her gaze flicked to the window, avoiding his eyes. "I didn't even know how long I'd been wearing it before he decided I'd earned the privilege of leaving the forest." Jackson wanted to say something to reassure her, to fix the past, but he knew that words were useless against the weight of memory. He only nodded, letting her continue at her own pace. "Some nights," she whispered, "I'd hear animals, or maybe people, and I'd think it was him. Every shadow was him. Every sound meant danger. Sleep was worse than being awake because the nightmares came alive. But I couldn't scream. Not then. Not ever." Her voice cracked and she pressed her palms to her face. Jackson leaned forward, gently resting a hand on her shoulder. "It's okay," he said softly. "You're safe now. You don't have to hold it in." A faint shudder ran through her and she nodded against his touch. For a moment, the cabin felt impossibly still, the kind of quiet that only comes when trauma has left an echo in the air. I didn't think anyone would ever find me," she said finally. "Not like that. Not in the forest. I thought, maybe I'd just disappear. Her voice trailed off. You didn't, Jackson said firmly. And you're not going to. Not while I'm here. Jasmine let out a small hollow laugh. You sound like you actually believe you're some kind of hero. Jackson shrugged lightly. I'm not. Just someone who doesn't walk away when I see someone in trouble. She gave a tiny smile, almost imperceptible, and the tension in her shoulders eased fractionally. For the next hour, they sat in a fragile rhythm. Jackson listening, Jasmine speaking in fragments, punctuated by long pauses. She described the forest, the way sunlight barely touched the ground, how the trees created tunnels of shadow, and how Gregory had built small traps, marking boundaries she had learned to fear. The more she spoke, the more Jackson realized the complexity of her captivity. It wasn't just physical. It was mental, psychological, systematic. Every detail of her description layered the fear, the isolation, and the control that had been exerted over her. You were incredibly strong, he said softly, even when it didn't feel like it. She shook her head, biting her lip. I wasn't strong. I just survived. That's all. Barely. But surviving doesn't mean you're free. Not really. Jackson stayed quiet, letting her words settle. He could feel the weight of her experiences pressing against the walls, heavy, almost alive. And yet, he also noticed small signs of defiance. Flickers in her eyes, the way she shifted to sit upright, the brief moments where she reclaimed control over her body, her voice, her words. Finally, Jasmine exhaled, leaning back against the couch. I don't know how I'll ever feel normal again. But, talking like this, it helps. A little. Jackson nodded, meeting her gaze steadily. Step by step. That's all we can do. You're not alone in this anymore. Outside, the rain picked up again, tapping against the windows with a sharp rhythm. A sudden gust rattled the cabin and both of them flinched. Jackson moved instinctively to the window, shining the flashlight into the surrounding trees. Shadows twisted in the wind, but nothing moved deliberately. Still, a shiver ran down his spine. Jasmine's hand brushed against his. I keep thinking, what if it's not over? Even here? Jackson squeezed her hand lightly. Then we face it. Together. The forest seemed to lean closer, silent, patient, as if aware that the two of them were plotting to reclaim a life that had been stolen. And somewhere, hidden in the shadows, a presence lingered, a reminder that danger had never truly left her, and that the next moment could change everything. Morning arrived slowly, as if the forest itself were reluctant to let go of the night. Pale light filtered through the trees, landing in thin strips across the cabin floor. Jackson was already awake, sitting at the small table with a mug of untouched coffee, listening. Not for birds. Not for wind. For patterns. Jasmine stood near the sink, staring out the window. She had changed into one of his oversized sweatshirts, the sleeves swallowing her hands. Her posture was different today. Still cautious, still tense, but upright. Present. You always wake up this early? She asked without turning around. Jackson glanced at her, surprised. Usually earlier. Old habit. From being rich? She said dryly. He huffed a quiet laugh. From being worried. Money just made me better at it. She looked over her shoulder then, studying him like she was deciding whether to believe that. After a moment, she nodded once as if filing the information away. That makes sense, she said. Worry keeps you alive. They stood in silence again, but it wasn't the same silence as before. This one had space in it. Breathing room. Jackson noticed something small but important. She hadn't flinched when a bird landed on the railing outside. Yesterday that sound would have sent her straight into panic. Today she only stiffened then relaxed. You want to help me with something? He asked carefully. She hesitated. Like what? Just checking the generator. It's loud but it's controlled. Predictable. She considered that. Okay, she said finally. But if I freeze, you don't rush me. I won't. They stepped outside together. The forest looked different in daylight. Less monstrous, more complex. Sunlight caught on wet leaves. Mist hovered low near the ground. Jasmine took it in slowly, like she was recalibrating her senses. The generator sat behind the cabin, half hidden by brush. Jackson explained what he was doing as he worked, narrating each step without realizing it. Jasmine listened, nodding, asking quiet questions. "What happens if it fails?" she asked. "Then we switch to battery backup and I call someone," he said. "I don't do single points of failure." She gave a faint smile. "You plan like someone who's been cornered before." Jackson glanced at her. "I have." That seemed to land somewhere deep. She watched his hands, then surprised him by stepping closer. "Can I try?" she asked. He paused. "You sure?" She nodded. "I need to remember how to do things. Normal things." He handed her the switch. Her fingers trembled slightly, but she didn't pull away. When the generator hummed to life, steady and loud, her eyes widened, not in fear but in something closer to relief. "It's loud," she said. "But it's ours," Jackson replied. "That sound means power." "What?" "Heat." She let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "I like that." Back inside, she moved differently. More purpose in her steps. She cleaned up the kitchen without being asked, reorganized items on the counter, then stopped suddenly. "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't mean to." "It's fine," Jackson said quickly. "Make it yours. As much as you want." She absorbed that, nodding slowly. Later, she sat on the floor by the couch, stretching her ankle carefully. Jackson noticed the way she tested her weight, pushing just a little further each time. "You're healing," he said. She shrugged. "Or pretending I am. Same thing sometimes." She smiled at that. A real one. Brief but unmistakable. The moment didn't last. A low sound drifted through the air, faint, mechanical. Jasmine froze. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. Jackson listened. At first he heard nothing. Then, there it was. A distant engine. Not close, but not far enough to ignore. "It's probably someone on the main road," he said, though his gut tightened. Jasmine shook her head. "That's not the road. That's closer." They moved to the window together. The forest stood still, deceptively calm. The sound faded, then returned uneven, like someone circling. Jackson's jaw set. He reached for his phone, checking signal strength. Still there. Barely. "Pack a bag," he said quietly. "Just in case." Her eyes met his. No panic this time. Only focus. "Okay," she said. "But I'm not hiding." He nodded. "I wouldn't ask you to." Outside, the sound cut abruptly. The silence that followed was worse, because now they both knew something had changed. Jackson sat back in the armchair, letting the tension in his shoulders ease just enough to breathe. The forest outside had returned to its deceptive calm, the distant engine now nothing more than an echo of possibility. Jasmine was on the couch, methodically packing a small bag he had set aside. Clothes, a flashlight, water, a few personal items she had claimed as her own. Every movement she made was deliberate, careful, and measured. No panic. No trembling. Just focus. "You're different today," Jackson said quietly, trying not to sound like he was praising her. She looked up briefly, her dark eyes meeting his. "Different?" "Yeah. Stronger. You're noticing things. Acting before reacting." Jasmine smirked faintly. "Maybe I've had a good teacher." Jackson raised an eyebrow, not sure whether to take that as a compliment or a joke. "I'm not sure if I like that." She laughed softly. "Don't worry. I'm not sticking around for a full semester." He chuckled, shaking his head, but the sound was tight in his chest. Humor, small as it was, felt like a fragile bridge between the past and the present. "Why do you keep checking everything?" she asked after a moment. "Windows, doors, the forest?" Jackson leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Because the world hasn't been kind to you. Not yet. And I refuse to let it get any closer than it has to. You deserve space to breathe, to think. Even to make mistakes." Jasmine nodded slowly, absorbing that in silence. She lifted the small bag and swung it over her shoulder. "I can do this," she said softly, more to herself than to him. "You can," Jackson said firmly. They moved toward the door, stepping carefully over the worn rug. Jackson checked the perimeter one last time, flashlight sweeping the tree line. The forest was dense, wet, and dark, but for now nothing moved. Nothing watched. And yet he couldn't shake the feeling that the quiet was temporary. "Do you ever wonder," she asked as they stepped outside, "if you're just buying time? That no matter what we do, he, or whoever's left, will find me again?" Jackson paused, taking a deep breath. "I can't promise that nothing will happen. But I can promise that I'll be there. Every step of the way. That counts for more than you think." Her gaze fell to the ground. "It counts a lot. But I've survived alone for so long. Trust, it's complicated." "I know," he said softly. "I'm not asking you to hand it over all at once." They began walking the perimeter together, moving quietly through the damp forest floor. Every snapped twig and rustling leaf made Jasmine flinch, but she kept moving. Jackson noted it, internally celebrating each small act of courage. "See that?" he said, pointing to a low branch. "That one's been loose for months. Could trip you if you weren't paying attention." She studied it, then stepped over it deliberately. "I notice," she said simply. The day passed in careful steps, each moment building trust and a quiet rhythm between them. Jasmine learned to check windows, lock doors, and even handle the flashlight for brief periods, her hands steady but her eyes vigilant. Jackson didn't push, but he offered guidance and reassurance with quiet patience. By late afternoon they returned to the cabin, soaked from the drizzle that had begun anew. Jackson set the bag down near the door and gestured for her to sit. "Small victories," he said, smiling faintly. "You notice. You act. You survive another day." She nodded, but the weight in her eyes was real. "Surviving is different from living," she said. Jackson paused, letting her words hang. "I know," he admitted. "And living is exactly what I want for you. Step by step, day by day. No shortcuts." The sky darkened outside, shadows stretching across the cabin floor. Jackson could feel the day's tension settling in the room like a heavy blanket. Yet beneath it there was something else, a fragile, tentative hope. Then a low sound cut through the quiet. Faint. Almost imperceptible. A branch snapping outside. Jackson stiffened, his senses immediately alert. Jasmine's eyes widened, but this time she didn't retreat. She stood, bag in hand, and glanced at him. "They're here," she whispered. Jackson nodded, swallowing the tightening in his chest. "Maybe. Or maybe the forest is just reminding us it's alive. Either way, we need to be ready." The evening settled over the cabin like a heavy curtain, shadows pooling in corners and stretching across the walls. Jackson sat near the fireplace, the small flames flickering against the darkening wood panels. Jasmine perched on the couch, her small bag beside her, fingers nervously tracing the strap. Neither spoke for several minutes, the silence thick, almost tangible. Then she spoke, voice low, almost hesitant. "Jackson, there's something I didn't tell you. Something about Gregory." Jackson's heart tightened. He had been preparing for more revelations, but the weight of the words still made him tense. "What is it?" he asked gently. She took a deep breath, as if measuring the distance between herself and the memory. He didn't just keep me in the forest. There were others. People I thought were safe, friends, family." Her voice faltered. "I saw things. I had to watch. Sometimes it was him, sometimes it was someone else. And he made me do things I swore I'd never do." Jackson's jaw clenched, and his fingers tightened around the edge of his chair. He had imagined the horrors, but her words painted a far more complex picture than he had expected. "Do things?" he asked carefully. "What do you mean?" She shook her head quickly, tears brimming in her eyes. I can't tell you everything. Not yet. But some of it, it's worse than just chains and fear. He broke people. I was forced to be part of it." Jackson's stomach churned, a mix of anger and sorrow. He wanted to leap into action, to demand justice, to tear the forest apart and drag Gregory into the light. But he knew that Jasmine wasn't ready for that kind of intensity. Not yet. Right now she needed containment, safety, trust. He took a deep breath. "Thank you for telling me this. That takes courage." She swallowed hard, nodding. "I'm trying. I have to. I can't stay broken forever." Jackson stood, walking to the window, shining the flashlight into the surrounding trees again. The forest seemed deeper in the darkness, shadows stretching like fingers. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that her past wasn't just a memory, it was still present, circling, waiting for a mistake. "Jackson," she said quietly, her voice trembling slightly, what if he finds me again? Even here?" He turned to her, his expression calm but resolute. "Then we fight. Together. No one else gets to decide your fate again." Jasmine let the words sink in, and for the first time since he had found her, she seemed to let herself believe them, even if just a little. They moved into the kitchen, preparing a small dinner in silence. Every sound, the knife on the cutting board, the water boiling, the rustle of a bag, was amplified in the quiet cabin. Both of them were acutely aware of the tension that hung in the air, fragile yet potent. After eating, they sat by the fire. Jasmine toyed with the edge of the blanket draped over her lap, hesitant to make eye contact. Jackson could sense her internal struggle, the desire to speak, the fear of unearthing memories too painful to confront. "You need to know something else," she said finally, voice barely above a whisper. "When I was with him, I overheard things. Names, plants. Things about money, people, influence. I think he was connected to more than just me." Jackson froze. His mind raced. If what she was saying was true, Gregory wasn't just a deranged kidnapper. He was part of something bigger, something dangerous. The implications made his stomach knot. "Do you remember any details?" he asked carefully. She nodded faintly. "Some. Not much. But enough to be scared. Enough to know I need to stay hidden. Enough to know that running isn't the only option." Jackson exhaled slowly. He realized then that the danger wasn't just the forest or the isolation or the immediate threat of Gregory. It was the web he had created, a network that might stretch far beyond what they could see. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the cabin's siding. A shadow flickered near the treeline, too deliberate to ignore. Jasmine flinched, but she didn't retreat this time. "We're not alone," she whispered. "No," Jackson said. "But neither are we powerless." The cabin was quiet except for the occasional pop of the firewood and the soft patter of rain against the windows. Jackson sat at the small wooden table, laptop open, fingers flying over the keys as he cross-referenced names and locations Jasmine had recalled. Each fragment she had given him, places, dates, people, was like a thread. And he intended to pull every one of them carefully, without unraveling the fragile trust they had built. Jasmine sat nearby, knees pulled up to her chest, watching him work. The glow from the screen reflected in her dark eyes, a mix of fear, curiosity, and determination. She no longer flinched at shadows or sounds, but every now and then, her hands would tighten on the blanket draped across her legs. "Do you think they'll find me?" she asked quietly, almost to herself. Jackson paused, closing a tab and swiveling to look at her. "Maybe. But that doesn't mean we wait to be found. We take the advantage first. Knowledge is power, Jasmine. Right now, that's what we have." She nodded slowly as if trying to absorb the weight of his words. "Okay. But what if I'm wrong about some of it? Or if I forget something?" "That's okay," he said, returning to his work. "We work with what we know. The rest we uncover as we go. No assumptions. No leaps without a net." For the next hour, they went through every scrap of memory she could offer. Jasmine spoke of cars with dark-tinted windows, a man she only ever called the courier, and encrypted messages she had glimpsed on a cracked phone. Jackson mapped everything, connecting dots, making a mental and digital grid of possible people and locations. Then she froze. Her hand hovered over a photo he had found online, a social media post that seemed mundane to anyone else but sent a jolt of recognition through her. That's him," she whispered. Jackson leaned in, studying the image. A man with sharp features, standing outside a private estate. "Gregory?" "Yes," she said, her voice barely audible. "That's where he went after I escaped. I think he thought I was gone forever, but that was a lie. He's still moving things. Planning." Jackson's mind raced. If she was right, the threat was far from neutralized. It was active, immediate, And it wasn't confined to some distant forest, it was potentially anywhere, stretching out in ways they couldn't yet see. He closed the laptop gently and turned to her. We need to be smart. We can't rush in blindly. We start small, gather information, and then act. Step by step. Like we've been doing. Jasmine nodded, her jaw tight, eyes flicking to the window. I can help. I remember things he said, patterns, voices, details he thought no one would notice. Maybe I can. Exactly, Jackson interrupted softly. Every piece you remember is part of our advantage. We'll use it carefully. We won't put ourselves at unnecessary risk, but we also won't wait to be hunted. The wind picked up outside, rattling the eaves and stirring the forest beyond. Jackson felt the familiar prickle at the back of his neck. Someone, or something, was watching. But this time he wasn't paralyzed by fear. He was calculating, alert, planning. You're different now, he said almost to himself, but she heard. You notice, you act, you survive with intention. That's power. She gave a small, uncertain smile. I'm scared, she admitted. But I don't want to be powerless anymore. Jackson nodded, feeling a surge of both pride and urgency. Good. Because the next step isn't just surviving. It's preparing. And we don't have forever. Outside, a shadow flitted at the edge of the trees. It moved deliberately, watching, waiting. Jackson caught the movement in the corner of his eye and held his breath. But Jasmine, instead of recoiling, leaned forward slightly, a spark of recognition in her eyes. They're coming, she said quietly. But I think I can see them before they see us. Jackson smiled faintly, a mix of relief and concern. Then we use that. The fire crackled, the forest murmured, and inside the cabin, for the first time in a long while, two people were planning not just to survive, but to fight back. The cabin had settled into a tense rhythm. Rain drizzled against the windows, and the forest beyond seemed alive with anticipation. Jackson and Jasmine sat across from each other at the small table, the laptop open, notes scattered around them. Every detail Jasmine recalled had been mapped, cross-referenced, and considered. Now it was time to act. Here's what I'm thinking, Jackson said, tapping a map he had printed. Gregory isn't just hiding. He's operating. Shipping information, money, moving people. If we follow the pattern, we can predict his next move, or at least get close enough to catch a trace. Jasmine leaned in, eyes sharp and focused. The courier, she said quietly. He mentioned something about a transfer a few weeks ago. I didn't know what it meant at the time, but her voice trailed off. Exactly, Jackson said, nodding. If we intercept or observe without being seen, we can start putting pieces together. Carefully. No rash moves. We need evidence, patterns, and leverage. She hesitated, biting her lip. I'm scared, she admitted. What if he notices me? Or worse, if someone else finds out I'm talking? Jackson reached across the table, placing a reassuring hand over hers. That's why we do this smart, step by step. You're not alone. And we won't do anything reckless. They spent the next hour preparing. Cameras, binoculars, a small portable scanner Jackson had brought from the city, and a checklist of locations she remembered from her captivity. Every item, every procedure was methodical, precise, like a game of chess where one wrong move could be disastrous. By late afternoon, the rain had ceased, leaving the forest wet but quiet. Jackson and Jasmine moved stealthily through the underbrush, careful to stay downwind, using natural cover as they approached the first location Jasmine identified, a small, abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of a neighboring town. This is it, she whispered, crouching behind a low fence. I saw him here a few times. He kept people moving in and out, always at night. They never stayed long. Jackson nodded, adjusting the binoculars. We'll observe tonight. No confrontation. Just gather intelligence. Hours passed in tense silence. Every rustle of leaves, every distant engine made Jasmine flinch. Jackson kept his hand close to hers, a silent reminder she wasn't alone. Then something shifted. A black SUV rolled slowly toward the warehouse, headlights dimmed. Jasmine's breath caught. That's him, she whispered. Jackson focused on the vehicle. It stopped near the loading dock. A figure emerged, tall, deliberate. Gregory. Or someone working for him. Jasmine's eyes widened. That's him. That's him. Jackson signaled for quiet. They watched as packages were moved as people, some coerced, some barely conscious, were loaded. Every movement was precise, controlled. Every detail Jasmine remembered from her captivity clicked into place. Do you see? She whispered. He's still running the operation. And I think he's planning something bigger. Jackson's mind raced. They had confirmation. The network was active, structured, and dangerous. This wasn't just about her anymore, it was about stopping him from harming more people. Then a noise behind them, a twig snapping. Jasmine froze, eyes wide, heart racing. Jackson's hand went to her shoulder, grounding her. Stay calm, he murmured. Probably just an animal. But we stay alert. Minutes stretched. The SUV departed, carrying its load into the night. Jasmine exhaled shakily. We need to tell someone, she said finally. But, not yet. We need more proof. More details. Jackson nodded. Agreed. We build the case, gather the evidence, and then we act. Carefully. Deliberately. As they retraced their steps back to the cabin, the forest seemed to watch them with renewed intensity. Shadows shifted between the trees, and the weight of what they had just observed pressed on both of them. The game had begun, and the stakes were higher than either had imagined. Night had fully settled over the forest by the time Jackson and Jasmine returned to the cabin. Mist curled around the trees and the air was damp, carrying the scent of wet earth and pine. The small cabin felt fragile under the weight of what they had witnessed at the warehouse. An entire operation in motion, and now the possibility that someone had seen them. Jackson shut the door quietly behind them and double-checked the locks. He moved to the windows, shining the flashlight across the perimeter. The forest was still, but his instincts screamed otherwise. They might have seen us, he said quietly, almost to himself. Or they might be cautious, waiting. Either way, we need to assume we're being watched. Jasmine pulled her knees to her chest on the couch, wrapping her arms around them. I knew it. I knew they wouldn't just leave me alone. Jackson crouched in front of her, holding her gaze. Then we prepare. We stay calm. We have plans, contingencies, ways to react. Her eyes darted toward the window. Plans don't matter if they strike first, she said, voice tight. Jackson shook his head gently. They do. That's the only thing that matters right now, being ready, not frozen. We'll use what we know to stay ahead. Hours passed in tense silence. Jackson monitored the perimeter while Jasmine tried to rest, though sleep wouldn't come. Every creak, every rustle of the cabin made her flinch. Every shadow seemed alive. Then there was a knock. A deliberate, slow series of knocks at the door. Jasmine froze. Jackson's hand went to his jacket pocket, where he kept a small but powerful firearm. His other hand gestured for her to move behind him. Who is it? Jackson called, voice steady but firm. A muffled voice responded. Delivery, package. Jackson narrowed his eyes. The warehouse encounter had trained him to be cautious. No delivery at this hour. No one would come here legitimately. Step back, he said to Jasmine. He reached for the door, checking the peephole. Outside, a courier van sat with its lights off, engine humming quietly. The driver's face was obscured. Gregory? Jasmine whispered. Her voice was tight, tremulous. I don't know, Jackson said. But we'll find out before we open this door. He retrieved a small security camera and positioned it to see outside the door. The image flickered on the laptop. A man stepped out of the van carrying a small box. The stance, the gait, too deliberate to be random. Jackson recognized it from the warehouse footage. They're testing us, he muttered. Watching reactions. Trying to see if we're alone. Jasmine's hands shook slightly. Do we open it? Jackson shook his head. No, not yet. We need more control. More information. He grabbed a small set of tools and quietly slid the door open just enough to peer out without being fully exposed. The man paused, glanced around, and muttered something under his breath. Jackson couldn't hear it clearly, but the tone was deliberate, patient, controlled. The man set the box down at the threshold, stepping back. Jackson's finger hovered near the camera, capturing every detail. Jasmine held her breath beside him. Then the man's eyes flicked up, straight toward the cabin's interior. He froze as if sensing something unseen. Jackson's pulse spiked. Suddenly he ducked back into the cabin, muttering, "Time to move. Now." Jasmine grabbed her bag, instincts kicking in. They bolted through the back door, disappearing into the misty trees. Behind them, the knock of the package, the carefully measured presence, remained a haunting reminder. The enemy was close, clever, and ready to strike. Mist hung low over the forest, swallowing the cabin in gray shadows. Jackson and Jasmine moved quietly, each step careful but deliberate, branches snapping softly underfoot. The night had turned cold and the damp air clung to their clothes. Every instinct screamed that they were being followed, but there was no panic, only focus. "Do you think they saw us?" Jasmine whispered, clutching the strap of her bag. Jackson shook his head slightly, scanning the tree line. "Maybe. Maybe not. Doesn't matter. We act like they didn't. We move fast, move smart." They navigated through familiar paths, though the forest seemed different in the darkness, each shadow a potential threat, every rustle amplified in the stillness. Jasmine's breathing was steady now, controlled, a clear sign that she was learning to master fear rather than being ruled by it. Jackson paused near a fallen log, crouching low. "We'll need to cross the creek up ahead. The water will mask our trail, but we have to be careful not to make noise." Jasmine nodded, crouching beside him. "I can do it." The creek was icy, water rushing over jagged rocks, slapping against their boots. Jasmine hesitated for a moment, peering into the dark, restless current. Jackson reached out a hand. "Step here," he whispered, pointing to a stable stone. "One at a time. Steady." She took a deep breath and placed her foot carefully, then the other. Jackson followed, mirroring her movements. For a tense moment, the forest held its breath with them. Then they were across, both silently exhaling relief. The path ahead narrowed, trees pressing close, and Jackson felt a prickle on the back of his neck, a familiar warning. Something, or someone, was close. He signaled Jasmine to stop, pressing himself against a thick oak. Jasmine froze beside him. A figure emerged between the trees, too deliberate to be accidental. Jackson recognized the gate from the warehouse footage. The courier. He wasn't alone. A second shadow followed, slower, carrying a small, precise bundle. Jackson whispered, "We split." Quietly. "Follow my lead." Jasmine hesitated, fear flickering across her features, but then she nodded. They moved carefully in opposite directions, the forest swallowing their movements. Jackson ducked behind a dense patch of brush, watching the figures pass. The courier paused, sniffing the air, crouching slightly, almost as if he sensed something, but then moved on. Jasmine, moving along her side of the path, froze as she glimpsed a glint of light in the distance, reflection from the courier's flashlight scanning the treeline. She ducked into a thicket, heart pounding, silently reminding herself to breathe. Minutes felt like hours, but eventually, they regrouped at a small clearing they had scouted earlier. Jackson crouched beside her, checking her bag. "We did well. No one caught us." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "That was close. Too close." "Yes," he admitted. "And it'll get closer. But this is the first time we've tested them and come out ahead. You stayed calm. You followed the plan. That counts for more than you know." She looked at him, dark eyes shining in the faint moonlight. "I think I'm learning how to survive on my terms now." Jackson's jaw tightened slightly. "Good. Because next time, survival won't be enough. We'll need to fight back. And we'll do it together." The forest around them seemed to shift, alive with unseen eyes. Somewhere deep within the trees, the sound of movement echoed, a subtle reminder that Gregory's reach was far from over. Jackson and Jasmine had escaped the first encounter, but the game was only beginning. By morning, the forest had shed its menace, at least on the surface. Sunlight filtered through the trees, turning the mist into pale ribbons that drifted lazily between trunks. Jackson and Jasmine had spent the rest of the night hidden in a shallow ravine, barely sleeping, taking turns keeping watch. When the birds finally began to call, it felt less like comfort and more like permission to move again. They reached a small roadside motel just after dawn. It was the kind of place people passed without noticing. Faded sign, gravel parking lot, the smell of old coffee drifting from the office. Jackson paid cash and asked no questions. Inside the room, Jasmine sank onto the edge of the bed, exhaustion finally catching up to her. "I hate this part," she murmured. "The waiting. Not knowing what's already caught up to you." Jackson locked the door and checked the windows. Waiting is still better than being cornered. He set up the laptop again, connecting through a secure hotspot. The warehouse, the courier, the van, everything pointed toward something larger, but they were still missing the center of it. Jasmine sat beside him, rubbing her temples. "There's something I didn't say before," she said quietly. Jackson looked up. "You don't have to." "I do," she interrupted. Her voice wasn't panicked. It was steady. "Because it changes things." She closed her eyes, searching through memory. "When I was first taken, Gregory wasn't in charge." "Not really." He answered to someone. "I didn't understand it then. I thought he was just saying things to scare me. But now it makes sense." Jackson's fingers stilled over the keyboard. "Answered to who?" "That's the thing," she said. "It wasn't one person. It was an organization. Not official, but organized. Lawyers, accountants, security, people who cleaned up messes. Gregory was just a handler." The words settled heavily between them. Jackson leaned back slowly. "You're saying this isn't just a criminal network. It's institutional." She nodded. "They talked about donations, foundations, real estate deals, charities that never actually helped anyone. Money moving through places no one questioned because the names sounded respectable." Jackson pulled up financial records tied to one of the warehouse addresses. What he saw made his chest tighten. Shell companies, tax shelters, trust funds. The kind of structure only possible with wealth and protection. And then he saw a familiar name. His jaw tightened. "That's not possible." Jasmine leaned closer. "What?" He turned the screen toward her. The name sat at the top of the page, surrounded by subsidiaries and advisory boards. It was his own family's foundation. "No," Jasmine whispered. "That can't be right." Jackson stared at the screen, pulse roaring in his ears. His family's foundation had been around for decades. It funded hospitals, scholarships, housing initiatives. His father's name had been synonymous with philanthropy. This had to be a coincidence. But the numbers didn't lie. Gregory's operation was moving money through the foundation's overseas partners. Quietly, cleanly, using the credibility of the name as a shield. Jackson stood abruptly, pacing the small room. "My father is dead. The board took over years ago. This could be a corruption issue. Someone abusing the system." Jasmine watched him carefully. Gregory used to say something. That no one ever believed victims when the money came from the right places. Jackson stopped pacing. "When I escaped," she continued, "I thought he was just being cruel. But now, I think he was confident. Because he knew who protected him." Silence filled the room. Jackson felt something fracture inside him. Not grief, not anger alone, but a deeper betrayal. His wealth, his legacy, the very systems he believed in might have been used to hide monsters. "We can't go to the police yet," he said finally. "If this goes where it looks like it's going, it'll disappear before it ever sees daylight." Jasmine nodded slowly. That's what he counted on. Jackson closed the laptop, his expression hardening. "Then we don't play by their timeline. We document everything. And we prepare for the possibility that the danger isn't just coming from the shadows." Outside, a car engine started in the parking lot. Jasmine moved to the curtain and froze. A black SUV sat 2 spaces away from their door. The same one from the warehouse. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Jackson, I think they already know where we are." The engine idled too smoothly to be accidental. Jackson watched the black SUV through the thin gap in the motel curtain, forcing himself to breathe evenly. Panic would only make them sloppy. "How long has it been there?" he asked. Jasmine shook her head slowly. I don't know. I just noticed it. Jackson scanned the parking lot. No driver visible. No movement. Just presence. Intentional and patient. They might not be here for us, he said, though his tone suggested he didn't believe it. But we can't assume that. Jasmine stepped back from the window. If they know about your family's foundation, then hiding won't matter. They already know who you are. That's what worries me, Jackson replied. They don't need to rush. They can afford to wait. He moved quickly, packing their things with methodical calm. No wasted motion. No raised voice. Jasmine mirrored him, her hands steady despite the fear tightening her chest. This wasn't the forest anymore. This was civilization, where danger wore clean lines and respectable disguises. We leave separately, Jackson said. You take the back stairs. I'll draw attention out front if I need to. No, Jasmine said immediately. Not again. We stick together. He hesitated, then nodded. All right. But we move now. They slipped out through the rear exit, the door creaking softly despite their care. The alley behind the motel smelled of damp concrete and old leaves. Jackson scanned both directions before motioning for Jasmine to follow. They reached his car without incident and pulled onto the road just as the SUV's engine revved louder behind the building. Did they see us? Jasmine asked. Not yet, Jackson said, merging into traffic. But they'll check the room. He didn't speed. Speed drew attention. Instead, he blended in, letting morning commuters surround them like cover. The SUV emerged a minute later, sliding into traffic several cars back. Jasmine saw it and swallowed. They're following us. Yes, Jackson said calmly. Which means they want us aware. He took a sudden exit, then another, doubling back through side streets until the SUV disappeared from the mirror. Jackson didn't relax. People like that didn't give up easily. They drove in silence for nearly an hour before pulling into a small diner just off the highway. Inside, the clink of silverware and low hum of conversation felt surreal. Normal. Almost cruel in its normalcy. They sat in a booth near the window. I keep thinking about what you said, Jasmine murmured. About your foundation. Jackson stared into his coffee. My father believed money could fix things if it was directed properly. He trusted the system. I trusted it too. And now I don't know what's real and what's performance, he said. If this goes as deep as it looks, then exposing it won't just ruin reputations. It'll destroy lives. Innocent ones too. Jasmine met his eyes. So what do we do? Jackson leaned back, lowering his voice. We find someone who can't be bought. Someone outside the usual channels. She hesitated. I might know someone. He waited. There was a woman, Jasmine said. While I was still trapped. She was older than the others. She used to whisper to me when Gregory wasn't around. She said she tried to report him once. That it almost got her killed. Why didn't she leave? Jackson asked. She tried. They brought her back, Jasmine said quietly. But before I escaped, she told me a name. Someone she trusted. Someone who helped people disappear when the law failed them. Jackson felt a chill. You remember the name? Jasmine nodded slowly. I wasn't sure it mattered before. Now I think it's everything. She reached into her bag and pulled out a scrap of paper, edges worn soft. Jackson unfolded it carefully. The name meant nothing to him. But the number beneath it did. It was local. Very local. That's less than 2 hours from here, he said. Jasmine exhaled shakily. Then we're not running anymore. Are we? Jackson folded the paper and met her gaze. No. We're stepping into their blind spot. Outside, across the parking lot, a man in a suit lowered his phone and looked directly at the diner window. And smiled. Jackson noticed the man smile a half-second before Jasmine did. It wasn't wide or threatening. It was small, controlled. The kind of smile meant to be noticed. Don't look, Jackson murmured, lifting his coffee cup as if nothing had changed. Finish your drink. Jasmine's fingers tightened around her mug. He followed us. Yes, Jackson said. And he wants us to know it. The man outside didn't approach. He didn't wave. He simply turned, walked to a gray sedan parked a few rows down, and drove away without hurry. That was worse. Inside the diner, the normal sounds resumed their place in Jackson's awareness. Plates clattered. Someone laughed too loudly. A waitress called out an order. Life went on, oblivious. They could have grabbed us, Jasmine whispered. Why didn't they? Because this isn't about force yet, Jackson replied. It's about pressure. They want us off balance, second-guessing every move. And it's working, she said quietly. Jackson paid the bill in cash. Let's go. They stayed on the highway for most of the drive, switching vehicles once at a rental lot outside a mid-sized town. Jackson kept his sunglasses on, posture relaxed, every move calculated to look forgettable. Jasmine mirrored him, though tension lived in her shoulders. The address from the scrap of paper led them north, away from the city, into an area where cell service thinned and houses sat farther apart. By late afternoon, the road narrowed, flanked by trees and old fencing. They reached a modest farmhouse set back from the road. White paint, chipped but clean. A barn leaned slightly to one side. Wind chimes clinked softly on the porch. This is it, Jasmine said, her voice uncertain. At least, this is where she said he'd be. Jackson parked a short distance away. We don't assume anything. We observe first. They watched for several minutes. No movement. No vehicles. Just the sound of wind and distant birds. Finally, Jackson approached the porch and knocked. The door didn't open right away. Then a voice, firm and wary, came from inside. You're late. Jackson stiffened. The door opened just enough to reveal a man in his late 50s, graying hair, eyes sharp with assessment. He scanned Jackson first, then Jasmine. When his gaze settled on her, something shifted, recognition followed by anger. They let you out, he said quietly. Jasmine swallowed. I escaped. The man opened the door wider. Get inside. Both of you. They stepped into a living room that felt lived in but guarded. No photos on the walls. No clutter. Everything had a place and nothing invited questions. My name's Samuel Reed, the man said. And if you're here, it means things have gone sideways faster than I hoped. You know Gregory, Jackson said. Samuel let out a humorless breath. Unfortunately. Jasmine sat, hands clasped tightly. The woman who told me about you, is she alive? Samuel's jaw tightened. For now. Jackson didn't miss that phrasing. Samuel studied Jackson again. You don't look like someone who stumbles into this world by accident. Jackson met his gaze. I didn't. Samuel nodded once. Then I'll be blunt. Gregory isn't the problem. He's disposable. The structure behind him isn't. We know, Jackson said. He's connected to a foundation. To money that looks clean. Samuel's eyes flicked briefly toward Jasmine, then back. You figured that out faster than most. How deep does it go? Jasmine asked. Deep enough that people vanish for asking that question, Samuel replied. Deep enough that law enforcement becomes a suggestion, not a solution. Jackson leaned forward. Then why are you still standing? Samuel's mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. Because I don't fight them head-on. I move people. I bury trails. I collect truths and wait. For what? Jasmine asked. For the moment they overreach, Samuel said. They always do. Silence settled. Then Samuel added, but here's the part you don't know yet. Jackson felt his stomach tighten. They already know you're here, Samuel said calmly. Not because they followed you. Because someone close to you opened the door for them a long time ago. Jasmine's breath caught. Jackson's mind raced. That's impossible. Samuel shook his head. Nothing about this is impossible. And if you want my help, you need to be ready for the truth. Outside, tires crunched slowly on gravel. Samuel didn't turn toward the sound. They're early, he said quietly. Which means you don't have much time to decide who you trust. The gravel crunch outside wasn't rushed. That was the most terrifying part. Jackson stood slowly, every muscle tight. How many? Samuel didn't move from his chair. He simply listened, head slightly tilted, like someone counting footsteps they'd heard before. 2 vehicles. Maybe 3 people. They're not here to storm the place. They're here to talk. Jasmine's pulse thundered in her ears. Talk about what? Samuel finally looked at her. About returning what they believe belongs to them. Jackson's jaw clenched. She doesn't belong to anyone. No, Samuel agreed calmly. But they don't see it that way. The sound of a car door opening cut through the air. Then another. Voices followed, low, unhurried, confident. Samuel stood and walked to a small cabinet near the fireplace. He opened it, revealing a false back. Inside were burner phones, flash drives, and a compact firearm he didn't touch. Sit, he told them. Both of you. And don't say anything unless I ask. The knock came next. 3 slow raps on the door. Samuel didn't answer immediately. The knock came again, firmer this time. Samuel, a man's voice called through the door. Polite. Familiar. We know you're home. Samuel sighed as if annoyed more than afraid. He opened the door halfway. 2 men stood on the porch. Both well-dressed. One older, silver at the temples. The other younger, clean-cut, eyes sharp with calculation. Afternoon, the older one said. We were hoping for a conversation. You're trespassing, Samuel replied evenly. The younger man smiled faintly. You've never minded before. Jackson watched from the shadows of the living room, heart pounding. Jasmine's nails dug into her palm. The older man glanced past Samuel, his gaze landing briefly on Jackson. Then on Jasmine. There it was. Recognition. Well, the man said, voice smooth. This simplifies things. Samuel shifted slightly, blocking the doorway. She's not leaving. We're not here for force, the younger man said. We're here for resolution. There's been confusion. Jasmine couldn't stay silent. She stood. You chained me in the woods. The younger man looked at her with something like mild regret. That wasn't my decision. The older man sighed. Gregory exceeded his mandate. We handled that. Jackson stiffened. Handled how? The older man met his eyes. He won't be a problem anymore. The words landed like ice. Jasmine swayed slightly. Gregory, gone? The man who had haunted her nightmares, erased as if he were nothing more than a loose end? Samuel's voice hardened. You don't get to clean your hands by killing the mess. The younger man smiled again. We're very good at keeping our hands clean. Then his gaze shifted back to Jackson. You, on the other hand, are a liability, he said. You've seen records you weren't meant to see. Jackson felt the weight of it click into place. This is about my family. Yes, the older man said. And about someone very close to you who understood how dangerous curiosity could be. Jasmine turned to Jackson, confused. What does he mean? Before Jackson could answer, the younger man spoke again. Your uncle, he said calmly. The one who took over the foundation's overseas accounts after your father died. Jackson felt the air leave his lungs. That's not true, he said, though doubt had already begun to bloom. He's been protecting the foundation. The older man nodded approvingly. He's been protecting it very well. Silence swallowed the room. Jasmine's voice trembled. Jackson, you said your family helped people. They do, the younger man replied smoothly. Just not the ones you think. Samuel stepped forward. Enough. The older man raised a hand. We're offering you an exit. Both of you. Walk away. Sign a non-disclosure. Forget names, faces, memories. We make this go away. And if we don't? Jasmine asked. The younger man's smile faded. Then you become a problem we can't afford to ignore. Jackson felt something harden in his chest. Not fear. Resolve. He stepped forward. You already made one mistake. The older man raised an eyebrow. And that is? You assumed silence was survival, Jackson said. But it's not. It's just slow death. The younger man studied him carefully. Outside, another car door slammed. Samuel glanced toward the window, then back at them. Your time's up. The older man straightened his jacket. Think carefully, Jackson. Blood has weight. And it pulls harder than you realize. They turned and walked back toward the cars. But before leaving the porch, the younger man paused and looked directly at Jasmine. "You should have stayed invisible," he said softly. Then they were gone. The dust settled slowly. Jasmine's knees nearly gave out. Jackson caught her, his own hands shaking now. "They killed him," she whispered. "Gregory." Just like that. Samuel closed the door and locked it. "Yes. And now you understand the real danger." Jackson looked at Samuel. "My uncle." Samuel nodded grimly. "That's the first twist of the knife." Jasmine looked between them. "First?" Samuel met her eyes. "Because the next one is worse." Outside, far down the road, an engine started again. And this time it wasn't leaving. The farmhouse was silent now, but the tension hung thick in the air like smoke. Jasmine sank into a chair, hands trembling as she tried to process what had just happened. Gregory, gone. But replaced by something far more insidious. Jackson paced, jaw tight, mind racing. His father's death. The foundation. The revelation about his uncle. And now, Samuel confirming that the people behind Gregory weren't just opportunists. They were organized, deliberate, untouchable. "They killed him," Jasmine said again, voice barely above a whisper. "And you said there's more?" Jackson didn't answer immediately. He crouched beside her, steadying her with a hand on her shoulder. "Samuel said the next one is worse. I think he means the network itself. Gregory was just a foot soldier. Now we're up against the generals." Samuel, who had been silent, finally spoke. "You've seen the surface. You've seen what happens when one piece moves incorrectly. But the structure, the people running it, they've covered themselves. Every trail disappears into a maze. Even law enforcement is sometimes a step behind, unwittingly cleaning their messes." Jasmine's eyes widened. "Then, how do we fight them? How do we stop them?" Samuel's gaze was steady, almost clinical. "You don't fight them directly. You pull at the threads until they unravel themselves. But you must be prepared for betrayal. And secrecy. Most of the time, the hardest enemy is not the one you can see, it's the one closest to you." Jackson felt a cold knot in his stomach. He had already suspected his uncle's involvement, but hearing it confirmed was like a punch to the gut. Someone he had trusted, someone he had respected, was implicated. "Do you trust anyone in this network?" he asked Samuel. Samuel shook his head. "Trust is a currency they never trade in your favor. Even allies can be enemies if they calculate the benefit. That's why we move in shadows. That's why we document. That's why you survive by anticipating what they think you won't." Jasmine shifted in her chair. "Then what's our next move?" Samuel gestured to the pile of burner phones and flash drives. "Information. That's your weapon. Every name, every transaction, every trace of corruption you uncover weakens them. You don't need to understand it all at once. You only need leverage and patience." Jackson nodded, absorbing the weight of the plan. This wasn't a single confrontation. This was a war of information, strategy, and survival. Outside, the sound of an approaching vehicle snapped their attention. The gravel crunched under tires. A large black SUV slowed near the driveway. Jackson moved to the window. "Too soon?" he muttered. The vehicle idled there, engine running quietly. No lights on. Someone was waiting. Watching. Samuel's eyes were sharp. "It's an envoy. Not necessarily hostile, but they're here to remind you of the consequences if you misstep." Jasmine's hands clenched into fists. "I thought Gregory was the worst of it. I thought escaping him meant I was safe." Jackson put an arm around her shoulders. "We're learning that survival doesn't mean safety. It means knowing the rules of the game, and that game just got a whole lot bigger." Minutes passed. Then the SUV door opened. A figure stepped out. Tall, slender, movements precise. Dressed entirely in black. Face obscured. Samuel didn't flinch. "They've sent someone to deliver a message. Watch closely." The figure walked slowly toward the house. A single envelope in hand. The gravel crunched under each step, deliberate and exact. Jasmine swallowed hard. "Is it for us?" Jackson's eyes narrowed. "Yes. And it's exactly what they want us to see." The figure stopped at the doorstep and set the envelope down. Without knocking, it retreated, disappearing back to the vehicle. The engine started, and the SUV faded into the distance. Jackson approached the envelope cautiously, kneeling to pick it up. It was heavy, thick, sealed with a wax stamp bearing a symbol neither he nor Jasmine recognized. He tore it open carefully. Inside was a single sheet of paper, typed with clinical precision. "We know who you are. We know what you've seen. Stop or you will be next. The foundation is ours. The girl belongs to no one. Choose wisely." Jasmine read it aloud, voice trembling. They're threatening me, threatening us both." Jackson felt a chill creep along his spine. This was no longer just about exposing Gregory. This was about survival, strategy, and facing a system that protected its own. Samuel's voice cut through the heavy silence. "Welcome to the real game. And now the first major twist is fully revealed. Gregory's death was only the beginning. The network isn't just operating, it's controlling. And they've already marked you." Outside, the forest and the road were quiet. But the tension inside the farmhouse was thick enough to suffocate. The rules had changed. And Jackson and Jasmine were now firmly in the crosshairs of an enemy far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. The farmhouse was tense, almost unbearably so. Jackson set the envelope on the table and slid it across to Jasmine, who touched it like it was a live wire. The wax seal, the cold paper, the clinical threat, it all made the danger real in a way that words alone hadn't before. "We need to move fast," Jackson said, his voice low but steady. "This isn't a warning. It's a timeline. They expect action or fear." Jasmine's fingers trembled slightly as she nodded. "So what now? We can't just run forever." Jackson shook his head. "No. We fight smarter. We expose them piece by piece without being seen. Samuel can help, but we need leverage." Samuel stepped forward. "Leverage comes from understanding the structure. Gregory was a layer. Your uncle, Jackson, controls the legal side, the facade. The real operations are hidden beneath subsidiaries, offshore accounts, shell foundations. We map it, then use it against them." Jackson clenched his jaw. "How do we start?" Samuel opened a drawer and pulled out a secure laptop, already booted. "We start with him," he said, pointing to a name on the screen. "Your uncle's right-hand man. He's sloppy. He communicates carelessly with the people managing Gregory's operations. If we intercept him, we can track the money, the locations, and the people involved." Jasmine leaned in, curiosity and fear wrestling in her eyes. "And you think we can do that safely?" Samuel's lips pressed into a thin line. "Safely is relative. You survive if you are precise, calm, and anticipate every move. Hesitation is death." Jackson and Jasmine exchanged a glance, silently acknowledging the gravity of the situation. They were no longer dealing with one man or even one network. They were playing against a system with decades of resources, experience, and ruthlessness. By evening, Jackson and Samuel had traced the first communications. Jasmine remembered a pattern from her captivity, a recurring code word Gregory used, Blue Oak. It seemed meaningless at the time, but when cross-referenced with the intercepted messages, it became a trail, one they could follow. "This could be our entry point," Jackson said. "We don't attack blindly. We watch, record, and wait for the perfect moment." Jasmine frowned. "And if they notice?" "They will," Samuel said matter-of-factly. "The network is always watching. But notice is not always reaction. They wait. That's their strength, and ours if we understand it." Hours passed as they monitored messages, traced locations, and built a strategy. Jackson felt exhaustion clawing at his mind, but he couldn't stop. Every name, every transaction, every subtle error in the network's communication was a thread they could pull. Finally, a breakthrough. One of the intermediaries used the same courier system that had transported people and packages for Gregory. A transfer was scheduled in 2 days, in a location reachable yet isolated. "That's our chance," Jackson said quietly. "We observe, gather proof, and plan a controlled interception. Not confrontation. Not now." Jasmine nodded, determination replacing fear. "We do this together." Samuel leaned against the wall, eyes sharp. Remember, the moment they realize you've seen too much, you're no longer invisible. Their response will be calculated and brutal. You can't underestimate them. Jackson felt the weight of the words. The first plot twist, Gregory's death and the revelation of his network, had shaken him. But this next phase required more than survival. It required cunning, patience, and the courage to confront truths he had avoided all his life. His family's involvement, the corruption masked as philanthropy, and the fact that the people they were up against had nothing to lose. That night, Jackson and Jasmine set up surveillance near the courier's drop-off point. The darkness pressed in around them, but they were prepared, equipped, and determined. Every shadow was accounted for, every movement tracked, every risk calculated. Hours later, the courier arrived. Not one but two vehicles. Packages were moved quickly, silently, efficiently. Jasmine's eyes widened as she whispered the details to Jackson, connecting them to patterns she had remembered from her captivity. Then, the first unexpected complication. The younger man from the envoy, the one who had smiled and threatened them weeks ago, stepped out of one of the cars. He wasn't alone. Another figure followed, masked by darkness but deliberate in movement. Jackson's pulse quickened. This wasn't a coincidence. They had been watched, anticipated, and now tested. Jasmine gripped his arm. They knew we'd be here. Yes, Jackson whispered. And that's exactly why we survived this. Observation first. Patience always. And when the time comes, we strike with certainty, not emotion. The night stretched long, tension cutting the silence with razor-sharp precision. Every movement outside the car was a puzzle piece, every shadow a question. And somewhere in the darkness, the network's reach reminded them. One misstep could undo everything. The drop site erupted into motion before Jackson could even finish his thought. The masked figure stepped forward, hands raised slightly, not in surrender but in command. The younger envoy smiled again, slow and deliberate, like a man savoring a moment he'd rehearsed. You really thought you were watching us, he said calmly. You never considered we were watching you learn. Jasmine's breath caught. Jackson felt something cold settle in his chest. This wasn't an ambush. It was an unveiling. Samuel's voice crackled through the earpiece. Abort. Now. But it was already too late. Lights snapped on from the surrounding tree line. Not floodlights, vehicles. Silent engines idling, doors opening, men stepping out with the confidence of people who own the night. Jackson counted quickly. Too many to outrun. Too organized to fight. The masked figure removed his hood. Jackson's world tilted. It was his uncle. Older than he remembered. Thinner. But unmistakable. Hello, nephew, the man said softly. You always were curious. That curiosity made you rich. It also made you dangerous. Jasmine stiffened beside Jackson. You knew Gregory was dead. His uncle nodded. Of course. Gregory was a liability. Emotional. Cruel. Sloppy. I allowed his indulgences because they served the system. But once he lost control, he had to be removed. Jackson's voice shook despite his effort. You trafficked people. You destroyed lives. His uncle's expression didn't change. I managed assets. I built structures. I funded hospitals, scholarships, disaster relief. You think the world runs on clean hands? The younger envoy stepped closer. We don't need to kill you, he said casually. That would be inefficient. We need silence. Cooperation. Samuel's voice cut in again, sharper now. Jackson. Trigger the file. Jackson's thumb hovered over the device in his pocket. His uncle noticed the movement and smiled almost proudly. You always did think ahead. But you think you're the only one with leverage. He gestured. A screen lit up in one of the vehicles. Jasmine gasped. Footage played, old, grainy, horrifying. Gregory. A younger Jasmine. Then something worse. A timestamp. A transfer authorization. Jackson's name. It was forged but convincingly so. They've prepared to make you the fall guy, his uncle said gently. If you release what you have, the world will believe you were complicit. Your empire collapses. She goes back into the shadows. And the system survives. Silence stretched like a held breath. Then Jasmine stepped forward. "You're wrong," she said, her voice steady in a way that surprised even her. "The system doesn't survive exposure. It panics." She turned to Jackson. "Do it." His uncle's eyes hardened. "Think carefully." Jackson thought of the nights he couldn't sleep. The money that had never made him feel whole. The girl beside him who had survived what no one should. He pressed the button. Simultaneously, Samuel activated the Dead Man Protocol. Files released. Encrypted data sent to journalists, watchdog groups, international task forces. Names. Accounts. Locations. Patterns. Years of rot exposed in seconds. Sirens wailed in the distance. Not police, federal. International. The envoy cursed under his breath. Jackson's uncle exhaled slowly, something like regret flickering across his face. "So this is how it ends." "No," Jackson said quietly. "This is how it starts." Chaos followed, but not violence. Arrest. Confusion. Orders shouted and ignored. The system, so carefully layered, began collapsing under its own weight. Hours later, as dawn broke pale and uncertain, Jackson and Jasmine sat in the back of an unmarked vehicle. Exhausted. Shaking. Alive. "You okay?" Jackson asked. Jasmine nodded. "For the first time. I think I am." Weeks later, the world was still reeling. Headlines spoke of betrayals, billion-dollar seizures, foundations exposed as fronts. Jackson's name was cleared. His fortune redirected, publicly, transparently, toward survivor rehabilitation, legal reform, real accountability. Jasmine testified. Then she chose silence. Healing. One evening, Jackson stood alone on the farmhouse porch, watching the sun dip below the trees. He knew the story would be told in fragments online, debated, doubted, dissected. But some truths didn't need embellishment. Kindness matters. Silence enables evil. And courage, once chosen, changes everything. If this story moved you, reminded you that quiet choices can ripple louder than power, take a moment to like and subscribe. These stories matter because they reflect the world we live in, and the one we can still choose to build. And if you've ever faced a moment where doing the right thing felt terrifying, share your thoughts below. Someone reading might need that courage today.